If you don't want to be included, feel free to turn your video off. Of course, you've been on Zoom calls now, so you know the etiquette generally here is stay on mute. There will be time for questions at the end. So if you want to come off mute at that point, feel free to do that. But also, if you have questions during Ericka's presentation, feel free to shoot them over to Zoe, who is stood here as the host at the CORRAL Riding Academy. And Zoe and I will be compiling questions as we go. And I will just voice those questions to Ericka at the end of her presentation in the Q&A time. So with that, Ericka, I'm going to turn the mic over to you and take us away.
Awesome. Well, I am so excited to be on with you all. I am trained as the person who I played softball for years, and the bases would be loaded and I would just come up and hit them home. So I get to hit you all home today. So I'm really excited about that. So let's see here. All right, you all. Well, I'm going to share my screen, but before I do that, I want to give a little bit of background about where this work came from, because I've been involved in this diversity work, and back in the day, what we called multiculturalism. I don't know if you guys remember that, like called it multiculturalism. And so been involved for years and been pondering things very deeply, and really am clear that Christians have a unique position and responsibility in this. So this framework comes through that lens. And so Joy and your CORRAL team, I am just so honored. You guys embraced the work and the stages and everything we're going to talk about today in such a huge way. So I'm so, so, so grateful for that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, you all, and we are going to jump in. So, of course, this is dialogue number 4 on dismantling racism. I'll talk a little bit about myself. I'm a CEO and entrepreneur, which is significant. And because from a background standpoint, I got to be in a family of entrepreneurs. And at the age of 5, my parents out in Seattle, Washington, started their own business. And I believe entrepreneurship is a key to really, really walking in freedom. And so I've been blessed to grow up in an extraordinary family that has owned their voice, and they haven't had to hold back. So that's why I want to put that in there. I'm a keynote speaker and trainer, and you will see from this that it is about training for me. I love that CORRAL gave me the title of social justice activist. I don't use that for myself. You'll see me in the boardroom working on getting resources to be able to be strategic and get people trained and equipped to transform. So I consider myself more of a transformational facilitator, but social justice activism happens in the process. And then the third bullet you're going to see on your screen is really significant. I am the first generation out of slavery 2.0, better known as sharecropping. One of the things I'm so grateful for, because my parents experienced such extreme discrimination down in the South, is they literally and intentionally picked up their family and moved about as far north as you can get and still stay in the continental United States to Washington State, back on affirmative action programs. My mother's a biochemist, my father's an agriculturalist and entrepreneur, and they came up to the Pacific Northwest in the late 60s. And one of the things he used to do to make sure we knew who we were and where we came from is that we would have these Saturday morning conversations. And they sometimes would happen in my parents' bed. My sister and I would crawl in there, or he would call us down into the living room. And you all, I have to tell you, oh, I used to hate those conversations. And we would get lectured about our family history. And one of the stories my father told me is that when he was 6 years old, he distinctly remembers his family having to pack up at the middle. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. And he was only 6 years old at the time, and they had every single thing they owned in that truck. And he was one of 6 or 7 siblings, and they all were in the truck with the family belongings, escaping the plantation. And they knew they had to get off the plantation because my grandparents had a commitment to educate their children, particularly their sons. And it would not have been allowed on the plantation. As a matter of fact, it would have cost them their lives. And they packed up and left in the middle of the night. And one of the myths that we live with in America is, why are we still having this conversation? Slavery was 400 years ago. Another part of this story that's so critical, and why we have to understand historically the context in which we walk, that slavery 2.0, our sharecropping, is just one generation out. And one of the stories my father told me was that his family, my grandfather, got paid for hard sun up to sundown labor with his hands every day, $3,000 a year. Here's the key we don't realize. He got paid once a year. Sharecroppers got paid once a year, and because reading and writing was kept away from people of color, particularly Black people, the slave owner, the plantation owner, kept the accounting. And if your family needed anything, every single piece of clothing, piece of farm equipment you needed, you had to go to the plantation. Better yet, let's tell the truth, the slave owner. And you had to get an accounting. And then at this one day of year, you would get paid. I want you to imagine in your life, if where you worked, you got paid one day a year. You had zero cash flow to be able to afford anything. You had no money in your pocket. That is slavery. And so I want us to understand, in context of what we're talking about today, that this was not 400 years ago. My father is now 76. So we're talking one generation. So I don't normally put that on part of my introduction, but it's really important for today's context. And you're going to hear me talk about this kingdom mandate for diversity, because one of the myths, and I know CORRAL is beyond it, but a lot of us Christians are like, diversity works, that's not us, or my church doesn't do that, that's that church over there. But I actually put some scriptures here, if you're not familiar with them, about how it is about coming in together with the nations. And that is really critical. All nations, all nationalities. And so I want to submit to you that we have a kingdom or Christian mandate, whatever corner of the kingdom you're in. We have a responsibility to reflect it, whatever color your skin might be. We have a responsibility to reflect and to really take strategic and bold action around diversity. One of the things that I found, this really great quote by Dr. Jarvis Williams: many Christians do not understand that racial reconciliation is a mandate of the gospel. They reduce it down to a social issue and therefore are not living in community with people from every tongue, every nation, and every tribe. As we look at the nonprofit community, very interesting statistics begin to come up. 80% of nonprofit staff leverage personal and professional networks, which are consistently ranked as the most popular and most effective recruitment channel. But yet 75% of white Americans have social networks without a presence of people of color. And so, you guys, I'm sorry, my family, I'm home in Seattle. My family is downstairs having a good time. So I want to try to ask them to be quiet here. Sorry, guys. All right. So we have to realize that there is a kingdom mandate on this. And if we're looking at nonprofits and why our organizations, oftentimes that are serving kids of color and communities of color, why do they not reflect the populations we're serving? Because most of our volunteer recruiting, most of our board recruitment comes from inside of communities of people that look like us. And it is absolutely natural for human beings to lean into those who are familiar. So one of the things we have to understand is that in order to become inclusive around diversity, and particularly racial diversity, because if we can get the racial diversity handled, we will develop the skill set to handle all of the different types of diversity that we need to handle. And so we have to understand, you've got to be intentional. It does not just happen. So I want to just answer the big elephant in the room question. Why is this so hard? Why are racial issues so hard in America? I have a lot of friends that aren't from here. And they're just baffled. Why is it so hard? Why is there so many issues between white folks and black folks and every hue of color in between? I just don't understand. And it's extremely compacted for Christians. And so I want us to understand that the transatlantic slave trade and slavery were often justified by religious leaders who argued that slave owners were performing a normal Christian duty by converting and enslaving Africans who were inferior to whites in the eyes of the church. After the Civil War, white churches supported racial hierarchy and segregation, forcing Black people to form their own churches. And we still see that dynamic alive and well, especially in the Southeast area, where Black family members and friends go to church together. We've got white churches over here. We have our Asian brothers and sisters over here. We have our Latinx brothers and sisters over there, but yet we serve one Jesus. It's fascinating to me. And I truly believe and submit to you today that the reason we have failed this in the world is because it is a mandate that has to come from within the body of Christ. We have a scriptural mandate for this, and the world doesn't. I believe and submit to you today that it is our responsibility to model this to the world. So, I'll talk a little bit more about the Black Lives Matter, but Joy brought up this picture that I shared in our training when I did this I think it was about 1.5 years ago. And this is a picture of, to me, it captures what was happening inside the church as it relates to slavery, as it relates to oppression of people of color. And you have here a pulpit, and the Ku Klux Klan represented and being celebrated on that pulpit. And one of the things we forget to realize is there was a reason they covered. They covered themselves because they were the police officers, because they were the judges, because they were the sheriffs, the lawmakers, the lawyers, the attorneys. They covered themselves so they can operate stealthily without people knowing the identity, because their day jobs should have been protecting the very people they were murdering. And so this is deep to me. And you'd think this picture was taken down in the deep South somewhere, but it was taken in Portland, Oregon. And I'm from Seattle, and there is quite a white supremacist collection up here in the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho area. But that was just fascinating to me, that this was something that permeated the reality of America. And so I want to talk about this concept of equity, because I often hear people saying, oh, we all need to be equal. I just want people to be equal. But equity takes into consideration the unfair treatment, and it is intentional about evening the playing field. And so that's my word that I resonate with. I love inclusion, but equity is about what do we need to change given the reality of what's happening. And it doesn't always look fair because it hasn't always been fair. And so we have to understand, I often hear people say, well, if we give resources to the Black community, it's not fair. Well, it hasn't been fair. And it's an opportunity for us to put time, talent, treasure, and resources into having it become more fair. So you're going to hear me use that word throughout this. There's two things as I really prayed on this, you all, and my primary gift is actually my ability to hear the Lord as a prophet. And so I was really careful as I put together these models, or I should say as I received these models, because I said, I don't want to just regurgitate what's out there. And one of the things that, again, I'm crystal clear about is our responsibility in the body of Christ. And so there's two things that the Lord said to me, that through the Holy Spirit, that if we can get these two things down as Christians, we will see transformation in this area and can literally, truly dismantle racism and so much of the destruction and division it has caused in America. And one of the things I want to say, I have an economics major. I'll talk about that. I'm an economics major, a degree in economics, but my minor's in urban American studies. And as that, in part of that process, I had to study slave systems around the world. And while there was white on white slavery, there was black on black slavery, everything in between, the white on black slavery system in America stands out because it was chattel slavery, and it was more brutal than ever. And if you remember that first slide, we're one generation removed from slavery 2.0. And so it's unlike any other slave system that existed in the world. That is why, you all, this thing is not easy. So I commend every single one of you for being on this call today, for taking part in these so critical dialogues that we need to have. But this first thing that the Lord said, he said, if we could understand that we are a kingdom citizen first, not a Republican, not a Democrat, not black, not white, not this title that we put on in our man-made experiences and our process of living. We are in the world, but we're not to be of the world. We are kingdom citizens. What would it mean if we truly died to self? But what has happened in the body of Christ is we've taken our prejudices, we've taken our biases, we've taken our experiential training, and we've just packed the bag and brought it into church with us. And so now we look far too much like the world. We're battling about the same things when the scripture says other things. And so first and foremost, we are kingdom citizens. And one of the things I invite my white brothers and sisters to do is to release the guilt and the shame. One of the things in my training I am so committed to do is is not leaving any race of people feeling ashamed and guilted. Yes, you need to feel that. It is part of the process. When you come into the awakening of the attempted annihilation and degradation of a people, you do feel that. But because we have Jesus, you all, we have the ability to put down our guilt and shame. And so that's the assignment. One of the assignments, I was in a diversity training the other day, a racial equity training, and to a majority group of white people. And they're like, how do we release this? We're now aware. We are aware. We took REI. We did these tough trainings. We're reading the books. And I just feel so much guilt and shame for what my ancestors did to Black people. And I said, let's release that because it doesn't move us forward. And so that's the first thing, because guilt and shame, I, as a Black woman, do not want anybody to do anything for me out of guilt and or shame. It does not move us forward as a people, and it really doesn't create the unity that we're needing to call forth. And so I invite my white brothers and sisters to release that. We have homework in the Black community to release the lie of inferiority, to release the lies that have been permeated systematically to us. So that's what I get to release. I get to release any leftover residual that I actually believed because of the color of my skin that I am less than. So we have internal work to do first, you all. Before we talk about organizations, we have internal work to do first. So we get to a place where there's no man-made divisions. The world cannot reflect that. That's on you and I as Christians. We get to model this thing. I don't care what your church environment looks like. If you don't have any chocolate in the vanilla, if you don't have any vanilla in the chocolate, it is time that we begin to release man-made division so we can begin to look like the kingdom. Another thing as I was praying, and I said, God, is it even possible that we can truly heal this thing? Because I'm so tired of the conversations and the division that in the process of trying to heal, that it perpetuates. And he said, if we begin to understand that we are kingdom citizens first, and we put down the things that have divided us and the labels and the titles. And then the second thing he said to me is that we must release and unravel the racial scarcity model that permeates the American mindset. And I was like, oh my goodness, Lord, tell me more about that. And this is my best attempt. I love models, you all. My best attempt at trying to capture what he said to me. But we have this belief, and I've noticed my white brothers and sisters in particular struggle with, if there's more fairness and equity, and we're going to use Black people, but you can fill in the blank with whatever that is. But this is the problem at hand that we need to solve. If there's more fairness and equity, if there's more resources, if there's more money, if there's more energy, effort, focus, and tension placed on fairness for Black people, evening the playing field, then there's less fairness, resources, and resources for others. So my goodness, if there's a quota, I hear that word all the time. We can't use the word quota, but we use quotas for everything else. We use quotas for sales production in business. We use quotas, but when it comes to a specific number and measured responsibility and goal in an organization, we're like, no, 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 no. And people start saying, well, if we have this many jobs that we're going to set aside or really focus intentionally on putting people of color in to even out the playing field, oh, well, then that's less jobs for my people. That's less jobs. And that, you all, is a sickness we've got to heal. So I mentioned earlier that I studied economics. There's a history behind that. I'll give you guys that story real quick. I actually was going to go to college to study civil rights and media, love media, but civil rights. And I was going to become a civil rights attorney. And I got to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights back in, gosh, what was it, 91, as an intern. And realized very quickly that we didn't need more laws right now. We needed economic fairness, and the answer was lying in economics. But here's the thing about that. My very first day in my economics class, they introduced the fundamental foundational law that our economics of capitalism exists on, and it is the law of scarcity. There is not enough for everyone. And I believe since we have adopted that into our very psyche, particularly in America, in the United States, we hold that, and it is bled over to our understanding in the way we hold racial issues. So if there's more for somebody else, another race of people, then that means there's less for us. And I want to submit to you that is one of the most pervasive lies that has been planted in our country, and particularly in the body of Christ. I hear it all the time. Here's where we want to go. We want to go to the together we are better mindset. And what that means is when we invest in underrepresented and disenfranchised people, we all rise. It's a radical shift from the racial scarcity model that says, no, 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 if Black lives matter, then that means you're saying my life doesn't and all lives don't matter. That's not at all what's being said. It's saying if Black lives matter, if we put some time, energy, and effort toward equaling the playing field that has been so disgustingly unfair, there's not less for anybody else. We all rise. So I challenge you all today to take a look in your lives. Where have we bought in to the racial scarcity model? If there's more jobs, more resources, reconciliation dollars, whatever it is, if there's reparations, there's less for us. My father ran and sponsored the bill out here in Washington State last year called I-1000. And years ago, they got rid of affirmative action out here. And it was because they said, if we set aside jobs for Black folks and people of color, there's less jobs for everybody else. When it actually raises up the economic situation and more jobs are created. And it was fascinating to me because the same gentleman that went against him 25, 30 years ago, he said, okay, the white folks in Washington are starting to wake up. And so I can't go to them and sell this racial scarcity model and get this bill put down, but I can go to the Chinese Americans. And he began to put this lie in them that this bill says, you know, Black students are going to get more scholarships and therefore your students won't. Black students are going to get this and Chinese students will not. So the race of people that came against this affirmative action bill was Chinese Americans overwhelmingly. Fascinating. And it proved to me that as long as you are holding this racial scarcity model, whatever color skin you might be, it is divisive, and it is our challenge to unravel this from ourselves, you all. And so I want to shift real quick. I know I'm ripping through this, but we want to get this down. Because one of my frustrations as I travel and train and do different things with organizations, and more in the last couple of years being called to do the work of diversity for organizations, one of the things I have found is that we have a lot of conversations and we have a lot of best practices. So this corporation is doing this best practice. This nonprofit is doing this best practice. And we come together and have these conversations about best practices, but there's no pathway. There's no place to really say, where are we as an organization? And where do we need to be? And what resources and time, talent, and treasure do we need to activate and put toward creating some results and some other outcomes in this area? So our organizations reflect diversity from the board level to the program level. The board is reflecting it, the staff is reflecting it, the donors are reflecting it, the program staff is reflecting it, and the people we serve are reflecting it. That is the challenge at hand, you all. And so I spent a lot of time meditating with the Lord, and this is what he downloaded. And so if you guys came to the training a year and a half ago or whatever, I've had them redesigned, so I'm so excited. But there's certain phases. There's 3 real phases an organization goes through, and even an individual. So you can look at this and lay your own life across it. But there's phase 1, and I call this aspirational identity, where we aspire to be something. We begin to come out of stage 1, unawareness. When you're not even aware, these are individuals that say systemic racism doesn't exist. What are you talking about? If we just work harder, we'll all have equal opportunity. That's like unaware. You can look at that organization and say, where are your people of color? Why are there no people of color at the decision-making level? Especially when your program serves a group of individuals that have color, that are Black folks or Hispanic, whatever your population may serve. And so you come out of stage 1, unawareness, and I will go into these a little bit deeper. And you go into stage 2, awareness, and you're still aspirational. Well, wow, this is where we are. This is where we want to be. Woo, we're just aspiring to this. We're just waking up out of the slumber. And that's what George Floyd's death did, because that was nothing new for Black folks. I got calls from my white friends like, Ericka, are you okay? I'm like, I am excited because a tipping point happened. I'm not excited that a Black man had to lay his life down. And he did. I call it laying his life down, because had he so much as flinched, it would have been a justified death. George Floyd laid his life down. And because of it, it became undeniable. And it came out of the blind spot of white folks and people who haven't experienced this oppressive reality every single day in this country. It is something we manage, whether it's direct or indirect, every single day. And so that awareness began to wake up on a corporate level. That tipping point occurred. And so if that was new for you, that was 30 years of Black people experiencing violence on videotape, and there was no justice for it. And so we're coming into awareness. It's aspirational. Okay, I'm getting aware. I see now there is a problem. It's undeniable. It may not have touched my life, but what do I do about this? I want to make an impact. I at least want to be aware. Then we move into what I call external identity. Stage 3, you're recognizing this. And you start saying, okay, we're going to start shifting some things. We're going to get some people of color on our staff. We're going to get some images of people of color on our website. We're going to start looking through a different filter. And then we start moving into stage 4 and making progress. And it's still external. It's not into the transformation of the organization yet. And I'll talk about that in a little bit on my next slide. And then we move into what I call internal identity, where it is intentional, and then synthesis, where it is part of the culture. It no longer matters who's leading. It is part of the culture from the top down. It permeates the culture, and it will be long lasting. And you can find yourself cycling through these stages very easily. And so you may say, okay, we made it to stage 3, and then something shifted in your organization that you're like, oh, okay, we're back to stage 2. And that's why it is a cycle. It is a circle. And we want to get us to what I call synthesis. So this next slide are the stages of the diversity and inclusion life cycle that I just showed you. And so when you're in stage 1, here are some concepts that are real in your organization, at your workplace. It could even be your family or inside of yourself. Unawareness. It's not on your radar. People say, well, that's not our church's job. That's that church down there. We'll let that organization handle that. You know, CORRAL probably heard that. Well, wait a minute, we're an equine therapy group. Why are we talking about diversity? Because it's unawareness. And so stage 2, it's on the radar of the organization, but no apparent or consistent action. And by the way, I did send these handouts to Joy and her team. So I'm hoping they will share them with you. I'm happy to share these. So I hope that's doable, Joy and Zoe, if people request. Yeah, great. Joy's giving me a thumbs up. So yes, you also can certainly get a copy of this. And so, and what you'll see across the top is what I call my diversity honor scale. And it's how the people in the organization begin to feel at each stage. And so in stage 1, when it's unaware in an organization, you feel excluded. And then you move to stage 2, you feel tolerated. It's usually championed by the disruptors in the organization. And it's not a welcome issue or conversation throughout the organization. We say, oh, I wish so-and-so would stop that. It reminds me of when I did some reading about apartheid in South Africa. And a lot of the white South Africans were like, we don't have a racial problem. It's just these black folks stirring this up. And they said the same thing about the civil rights movement here. We're fine. We don't have any problems here. I wish these troublemakers, Dr. King and Malcolm X, I wish they'd just be quiet and go away because we're good. That's when you're an unawareness, and then you move into awareness where there's enough disruptors happening, people are talking about it. And if you're involved in that, you tolerate people of color. They're just tolerated. Probably could give them, they're still invisible. I don't know if my brothers and sisters on this call, if you've ever felt like you are invisible, that is a very real thing that I've had to deal with. Being a Black woman, being in the environments, but being invisible. And a lot of us are waking up to that. Wait a minute, I've had Black neighbors for years. I've never talked to them. I've had I've had Black people, not necessarily in my proximity, but close enough that I could talk to them in the church or whatever it is, and I haven't done it because it hadn't been on your radar. And then you move into awareness, starts to get on your radar. The organization says, okay, maybe we want to do something about this. Not quite sure how. And then you move into stage 3, recognition. And people of color tend to still feel tolerated in this, but the organization's waking up. They're realizing that it is an issue, and they begin to commit to taking action. Now they're having conversations about it, but they're still kind of emotionally charged, so no solutions are happening. I hear this all the time. Well, I wish we could have more Black board members, but we just can't find qualified talent, or we don't know how to find diverse champions. Or we're okay with the token. We recruited, we have Ericka on the board, we're good. And Ericka's gonna be the one to champion the diversity issues for us. Woo! Still feel tolerated as a person of color. And then you begin to move into stage 4, what I call progress. You're saying, okay, you're welcome now, because the organization is saying, come, we want you to come. And it's making progress on diversity. It's not measured, it's not systematic, it's not sustainable. There's efforts toward the board or leadership staff and champion recruitment, but it is still an underrepresentation of people of color. And usually your people of color feel welcome. They're glad, they're received with pleasure, they're invited to participate and be engaged, but they're not necessarily feeling that way over a longer period of time, or they feel like it's kind of fake because we're doing diversity initiatives. That's the only reason y'all are happy to see me today. It's not in the culture yet. It's not in our hearts of an organization as individuals. And then you move into stage 5. And that stage 5, that progress stage, we're making progress, but it's still not measured. And so we've got support. The board is saying, yes, let's do this, but there's no strategic initiative. There's no numbers put to it. You all, it is not hard to figure out where we are with racial diversity. Some of the other forms of diversity, absolutely that could be harder. But typically, if we can nail this thing with racial diversity, we can do this. You're making efforts toward diverse board leadership and staff, and champion, meaning volunteer recruitments. That's a mission triangle language. And it's still usually champion though, championed by underrepresented groups within the organization. This is when a board says, yeah, we know it's a problem, but we only have 3 initiatives to choose from. It didn't make the cut. Whew. Stage 5, it's intention. And your people of color tend to feel accepted and celebrated, but they're still asked to leave their culture at the door. You're accepted, you're celebrated, but you're not quite yet honored. The organization's intentional about diversity, inclusion, and equity, and it is alive and well. There are diverse teams of people who are able to work together. It's not highly, awkward or emotional or tense or any of those things that happen when we start being in proximity to one another if we're not accustomed to that. There are goals around it. You begin to measure things. And then stage 6 is that synthesis, where diversity, inclusion, and equity are ongoing, inherent, and they are integral to the success of the culture. It's a priority, and it's championed by everyone, and it is not dependent on a particular leader. Isn't that good? I want you to just stop for a minute and think about where the organizations you're involved in are. Your church may be stage 1, but your organization may be stage 4. And just take a look. Where are you in your heart? Maybe you're just waking up. You didn't realize until you saw that George Floyd video how deep this problem was. I have a friend who's from Canada, and he called me. He's like, Eric, I just don't understand. I'm from Canada. We don't have these black-white issues. We've got them with the natives here, but not necessarily the black and whites. I don't understand. He literally was like, what's going on? This thing just woke me up. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And so you all take a look at where you are as an individual, where you are as an organization, and it's about continuing to take these issues out of our blind spots. And so I want to give you some next steps, and as Joy and her team are so committed to, I'm just so proud of CORRAL that you all are taking steps. This is just the beginning response, and you all have been on this journey. You sent your teams to trainings, and so CORRAL is on this journey. There will be much more to come, and I am just ecstatic that this is a board level initiative. That is extraordinary. But there are some personal next steps we can take. I want you to be willing to change your filter. And I get to do this too. What's the filter change that needs to happen? And I've got about a couple more minutes and then we'll open up to questions. And it's fascinating because oftentimes when I'm doing trainings, I tend to be called into white affluent organizations to do these. And so I was sitting with one of my training organizations the other day, and I said, what do you think the experience of a Black person would be coming to this organization? And I want you to take off your filter, your training, your experience for just a minute. And I want you to try on someone else's. Change your uniform. And it's fascinating. I've done this exercise over and over again. And the barriers that come up and the awareness that actually when you're willing to change your filter, you actually can walk in the shoes of someone else, not their experience, but perhaps some awareness and maybe some understanding. Be willing to change your filter. Change your filter. Make a personal impact, a commitment for impact. People often ask me, well, Ericka, it's such a huge issue. What can we do? You have an assignment that's a corner of the kingdom of God. Wherever you are planted, do the work inside yourself, and then have it be impactful for the organization you're in. Start to question, start to ask. And one of the things I want to tell you, particularly if those of us that are at the table, those that hold the power, stop assuming what you think other people's experiences are and ask them. Open up dialogue. And so make a personal commitment for impact. And then use your influence in the organizations and businesses in which you serve and participate. I love working with nonprofits and I love working with entrepreneurs because there's a sense of freedom and purpose that oftentimes corporate America isn't in. Or you don't want to say something because that person that signed your paycheck may not like it. But when you are an entrepreneur, you've got a nonprofit, it's part of your purpose, you actually can go after this thing. And here's another thing, you all. we get to do the internal work of confessing, repenting, and reconciling with God. And when we do that within ourselves, and that comes in your quiet prayer time with the Lord. As a person of color, there's things that, that my heart aches for. We get to forgive. You all, the world doesn't have the skills and the tools that we have to model this thing. We get to forgive ourselves. I get to forgive the white supremacists. I get to forgive the systems. I get to forgive those that aren't aware of their white privilege. I get to forgive my brothers and sisters for buying into any residual of that inferiority, for still operating under oppression. I get to forgive that. I get to confess where I am. I get to repent, turn from that. And reconciliation, the Lord said, is between me and my children first, and then we will reflect it externally. And then lastly, I'm just so tired of the talk. I'm so tired of the rhetoric. We've been doing that for centuries, for decades. Let's take bold, strategic action right where you are. Give yourself a 3-year runway and say, this is where I am right now. This is where this organization is I'm a part of. But in 3 years, this is what I want to see. And you begin to champion it. And it doesn't matter the color of your skin. We all have a kingdom mandate for diversity. So lastly, I've put my contact information if you've got questions or need to get a hold of me. But again, they're going to share these handouts with you. And that's my share for today. And I am going to stop my share real quick, and we will be able to manage questions. So I hope that was enlightening, but most of all, that trainer in me wants to give you tools and process. So that's all I have, Joy and Joy. I was going to say Joy and Zoe. That's what I have for today. Oh, okay. So Zoe, do you want to manage the questions, or do you want me to open the chat, or how do we want to do this?
Oh, so I can moderate the question here. Thank you so much, Eric. That was really powerful. You gave us a lot of information. So we have to really unpack that as a group. My first question is, you talked about making things measurable. And I can say from my perspective, I remember a conversation with my team a year or so ago, and we were saying, and I was saying something to the effect of, well, we have this diversity statement, and it's in part of our core values, and what more do you want from me? And my team said, we want this to be measurable. And it just stopped me in my tracks. And I didn't know what that looked like. So what does it look like to have diversity, inclusion measurable in our churches or our nonprofits?
Oh, that's such a good question. So if you are an organization that serves communities of color, you want your leadership to be reflective of that. So if 60% or 40% or 20% of the population you serve is made up of children or adults or young adults, whatever your target group is, or adults of color, then you want it to be reflective in your organization. There cannot be enough said for that familiarity factor that human beings naturally have. When you walk into a place and you see people that look like you, your very existence is affirmed. And so being aware of that, if we're bringing in Black children to our program, or Latino children, or whatever it is, your population needs to reflect that in at least those percentages. If you were an organization that's like, look, Ericka, we're lily white, we don't serve anybody with color, any color, where do we go? Then have it look like the world. So there are clear percentages of, what are the percentages in your community? What are your percentages in the areas that you may be geographically located? What's the percentages in the country? And that's how you begin to say, we are going to reflect our community. We are going to reflect the population we serve. We are going to reflect the diversity in the United States. And those are how you kind of get a baseline, Joy, to get those numbers going.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and that the number itself will vary for organization, but it's a percentage.
Fantastic, that's very clear.
Yes.
So the next question I have is about how to approach this in organizations when we're fearful. So let me paint that picture a little bit more. So I know, CORRAL, for example, we are dependent upon donations, and so to speak up sometimes invokes fear in me. And if you're, the writer of this question is in a corporate world, and as you mentioned, a person that they might be speaking up to, asking for greater diversity, is the person who writes their paycheck. And so for a lot of us, when we think about how to have this conversation in the institutions we work in, it invokes a lot of fear. So can you talk us through how to navigate that?
All right, so I have an answer that you guys are going to meet the other part of me for a moment. I am a minister, and I walk in the apostolic over my own ministry, over a ministry called Kingdom Ministers Association. And the first thing I want to tell you, Joy, is a spiritual thing, because fear is a spirit, and we can take command over that through the power of Jesus. And so really begin to pray and release the fear. Like literally, fear in the name of Jesus, you have to go and just breathe that thing out, let it go, because fear is a spirit and it has real fruit and it stops us from doing things. And so you want to release that fear first of all. And then the reality is there might be some resistance in the organization. For some of us, we might be like, this could potentially cost me my job or whatever that is. Assess the risk. And then the coach hat in me is going to come on. We have a coaching skill called walking the plank. And when you walk the plank, you go over every potentially horrible outcome that could be. Like, I could lose my job, I could be blackballed, I could be, whatever it is. Whatever that is, I could be completely excluded. And you create a mini plan for that. Like, what would happen if this happens? So you're not caught off guard. So you walk the plank. That is like a real life coaching skill. And so you can walk yourself through walking the plank. Like, okay, what's the worst case scenario? I don't know. The board can throw, paper at me. I don't know, whatever it is. What is that? And are you going to can you live with that? And if they do that, then what's your plan of action going to be? So you don't have to walk in going, oh my gosh, I can't say anything. I'll never get another job ever. You might even want to say, okay, wait a minute. There's more jobs in the world. It's okay. I'm willing to do this. Assess your risk level. And then if you're one that's like, I can't be quiet about this, then you get to assess kind of the environment. There's always politics. Assess what's happening politically. Is it best for me to say it at this meeting? Do I need to document something? Where is it? Who are the influencers in that particular area? And how can I get in front of them? And then there is just a point, Joy, you just have to be bold and say, you all, this is the reality. And if you're dealing with people who do traditionally not come from diverse groups, did I say that right? So white folks, if you're dealing with white folks, you've got to document. You've got to have proof. You've got to have statistics. You cannot just come from an emotional place. We're heart people. Black folks, you just feel it. And we'll be like, you just got to do it because it's the right thing to do. But that doesn't work for the white psyche. You have to give reason. You got to find out where it affects them the most if they were to become diverse. That if we became diverse, we'd actually have more donor dollars because we would better reflect. Like, what are the benefits of diversity? Unfortunately, we do have to bring that to the table. And I would document that and come out of the emotion, because it's so emotional. Emotions, they don't get results in this area. But start to document, walk the plank, cast out that fear, and then decide, am I willing to do this? Is God calling me to do this? I have to do this. And so, yeah, and then document, and get some measurables in there, how it's going to be of benefit. Because once we understand that, we'll start moving forward. And again, coming out of that racial scarcity model, oh my goodness, if we bring more Black people to the board, then what's happening? If our worship teams have more, whatever that is, there's fear associated with that, not just in you, but in other people, because we hold that racial scarcity model. If we do this, if we put energy here, then we're going to lose in some way. And so you really want to challenge that mind frame, or that mind work and framework. Does that help? Yeah, good.
Yes, that's super helpful. Definitely the spiritual part really resonates with me, but I also hear you talking about being really strategic and not not reactive or responsive. Okay, so
Right.
the next question we have is about boards and volunteer bases. Of course, that's relevant in a nonprofit organization. But how do we recruit? How do we get a diverse board and a diverse volunteer base that reflects either the people we serve or our entire community at large?
That's so good. And I'm fascinated that we're asking that question in the Southeast when there's people of color everywhere. Like if you're maybe up in Lacey, Washington, where I'm from, we can ask that question, but there's Black folks everywhere. There's professional people of color of every hue, race, and ethnicity. So if someone's asking that question, they're on a stage 1 or 2, it's not in their awareness. And so first thing is to become aware. And then the second thing is to really, you have to be intentional. And I want to say this again, you guys, diversity does not just happen. You have to be intentional. So you can say, I just worked with an organization that said, we have 4 positions coming available, and we want Black people in those positions. And they intentionally leaned into that. And I think 3 out of the 4 positions, and they said, and we want qualified, and we want this. And I actually had to help them get into the circles of qualified professional people of color. Because if that is not in your proximity, we go, well, I just don't know anybody. And then we just leave it at that. Well, I just invited this person into the board because that's where I had relationship. But listen to me, there are professional, brilliant, genius, qualified people of color everywhere, but we function in silos. So there's a ton of African-American people, Black people who want to do service. There's billions of dollars given in the Black community. We give it through the church. How do you tap into that? Where are the Black professionals? Where are the Hispanic professionals? They are everywhere, and you may have to create a pathway to get to them. And oh my goodness, go outside of your comfort zone and actually go communicate. Take some field trips, get out there, get out of our little worlds. And I say that if all we're around is people of color too, you got to get out and go experience so you're comfortable sitting at the table, sitting next to, being in proximity with people of color. And then you're intentional. Do you have board position descriptions in the historically Black colleges? Do you have them in the places that Black professionals gather, the fraternities, the sororities? Do you have your job descriptions in these places? Because there's a word of mouth network that operates in communities of color. And so you've got to understand where's the community center for those organizations, and you have to go introduce yourself and make yourself known that you've got a position or you're looking for board members. But it takes absolute intention, and it is absolutely possible. Can you tell I'm passionate about it? I'm so tired about people using that excuse. Oh my goodness, I could just scream. But yes, anywho,
well, I
a
can
good
tell
scream,
you that,
but yeah, it's so doable. Yeah. It looks like lots of questions are popping up. One I did see pop up, do I come and do this presentation to schools and organizations? Absolutely, let's talk. I need some notice, my schedule's a little hairy, but yes, it is time. It's all about timing, and it's time to get out. And I think people are hungry for solutions and coming out of the divisiveness and the emotions. If your organization is ready for solutions and action, then that's when I come in. If you just want to fuss and fight about it, then they're not quite ready for me. There's probably some other facilitator they need to bring in first. So, but yeah, absolutely. Best response ever about
the recruitment
of color. I love that. Great comment. Okay, go ahead.
So on the recruitment bit, I can definitely say that, I have fallen to that. I think when we spoke a few years ago, that's where I was, and I heard an amazing talk from Salesforce about this, and the recruiter said it's more than just did you post the job to HBCUs. It's it's more than just I interviewed one Black person. It's did you find the professional women's accountant group and specifically reach out to members, ask to put that job in that group, or something strategic of that nature.
Yeah, you
so
broke
I
up
can
a little
tell
bit
by
there,
your
but I
voice
think
I'm
you
breaking
said,
up. So
I want to summarize that to make sure everybody got that. What I heard you say is it's beyond just posting a job at a HBCU, historically Black university or college, but it is about creating relationship, really, going out of your way to go introduce yourself. And then we get the people of color in our organizations and we're not even ready. So you've got to do some organization work also, because there's so much in our blind spots about how to make the workplace a safe place for people of color that we just assume. And so we got to do that work together. Yes, we're recruiting. Yes, we're being intentional. But how is it when they get here? Are they heard? Are they welcomed? Are they honored? Or are they just tolerated? So there's internal and external work that needs to be done. So.
On that internal and external work, last question, but we experience internally a lot of microaggressions. And I know that even we've seen that at CORRAL recently. So how do we deal with microaggressions addressed at people of color in the workplace?
So give me an example of what you call a microaggression so we're all clear.
Let's see, I'm trying to not to use an example of one that's too close home. So it might just be simple, okay, I think of one. As we had a discussion in our office recently about this, you know, one person who was a white individual looked at the entire group and said, you know, the answer here is the oppressed people need to just forgive. Forgiveness is the answer. And you did speak about forgiveness being part of the answer, but that was in that particular case, that was a form of a microaggression.
So I know we're at our time. I'm going to answer this, but I have to tell a story to answer it. So one of the first things that happened to me, and I'm growing up out in Washington State, I'm telling you, my parents made us very aware of who we were as Black young ladies, what that meant. And I remember going to college for the first time because I had to stay in state for college. And I was in a sociology course. And it was one of my freshman courses. There's probably 350 students, 300 some students in this lecture hall. I believe I was the only Black one in there. And the professor says, Blacks are on the bottom rung of the social ladder. And it was this awkward silence in class. Like we were all like, what? And he said, wouldn't you agree, Miss Jackson? And that's my maiden name. And I was mortified that he knew my name. He somehow looked on the schedule of kids and saw that I was the Black one. And I was supposed to confirm that statement in front of my 300 other classmates my first week of college. And my voice got stuck. I call it getting stuck on stupid. I mean, I couldn't think of a word to say. I remember feeling heat come up my spine because I got all emotional. And I made a commitment that day. And I actually never said anything. One of my white students didn't know her. She says, well, that's not a fair statement to make. You cannot make generalizations about an entire race of people that way. And I thought, if I had a voice in that moment, that's what I would have said. And I made a commitment that I would never again let that emotional stuff that rises up stop my voice from speaking. I would have the knowledge to be able to have an intellectual conversation. I would have the voice, like process the emotions privately so they don't come out publicly like that at the table. Now, I'm not saying there's not emotional conversation around this, but in a time like that, in a microaggression, we have to have our voice, not get home and say, gosh, I can't believe that person said that. I wish I would have said this. But getting aware in that moment, having a commitment in that moment that we can shut that down. Yes, forgiveness is important internally, but that will not just solve the issue. We need this, this, and this. Because you thought of it, because you're well-read, because you have some experience, you can move past that moment when whatever that microaggression might be, when there's awkward silence in the room and everybody's just looking at each other and you can't think and move. Get your voice around racial issues. I don't care what color you are, get your voice. If you don't know enough, get some books. If you don't talk enough about it, talk more about it. It is not an easy subject, but it is a necessary one to never again lose your voice around. So those microaggressions are going to happen as that darkness stirs up. And so we need to be prepared for that. Almost assume that, you know what I mean? Like almost not on a defensive way, but it's just stirred up right now. And so don't lose your voice ever again. Get your thoughts together, get your voice together. So in those moments, we have a response that's going to make an impact.
That's powerful. Thank you. So folks, thank you so much for being here. Ericka, thanks so much for a powerful hour together. This has been really, really, really excellent. This will be recorded. We will send out the recording. We will also send out the slides. And stay tuned from CORRAL as to how, as an organization,